anecdotes. This period of our time is a very, I almost get anxiety when I talk about this. I know it might sound very strange to you, go, why do you get anxiety from an episode in history? Well, because, if you're so attached to these periods of time, this is something that is very mysterious to me and very tragic. Mysterious because a lot of written records don't exist about this period. And what period am I talking about? It's right before the fall of the Assyrian Empire, and then what happens, the struggles as the Assyrian Empire is falling, the Assyrian state is falling. And historians have made these proclamations throughout history that, boy, and we're going to quote some of them, that it was the disappearance of the Assyrian people. It was so bad, Nineveh was turned into heaps and ruins, and all one can see is desolate Nineveh, desolate Ashur, desolate Nimrud. It was just all gone. So what happened to the people? Well, they disappeared. And I remember a conversation of myself and my friends, Sargon Hassu, who's one of the brightest stars of our language. I don't know if you know Sargon Hassu, Dr. Sargon Hassu. He's just incredible when it comes to the Syriac language. And Peter Bitbasu, who runs AINA, Assyrian International News Agency. So there we were in college at the time, and we're standing around wearing our 80s clothes and kind of milling about the Assyrian American Association. And either Sargon or Peter, because we had read so much about this topic of the fall of Assyria and the disappearance of the Assyrian people, and so many scholars saying, well, you're not really Assyrian, you're Aramaic-speaking Christians, or you are Syriac-speaking Christians, you're not really Assyrian. So we stood there kind of looking at each other, and kind of one of us asked very sadly, said, hey guys, what if we're really not Assyrian? What if we're something else? And I remember one of us said, I wouldn't want to go on this way. I mean, think of how profound that history of the disappearance of the Assyrian people had impacted us. And I always think that it's a good thing to be attached to history, maybe not as much as we were, so concerned that, boy, if we were something else other than Assyrians, we've been fooling ourselves all this time. We better get it straight now. And I don't know if I want to live, knowing that I'm not really an Assyrian. What am I? So the period that we're talking about caused a major disruption. You're talking about an empire that lasted a very long time. The Assyrian Empire, as you know and as we've been discussing, ruled over all of the areas that are called the Near East. In fact, it's because of the Assyrian Empire that we know the Middle East and North Africa as kind of one cultural entity, today. Without the Assyrians, this would not have been possible. And so, how did it rule this area? And you have to understand the impact that the Assyrian Empire had on the peoples that lived within the empire was tremendous. It was incredible. It wasn't simply just, they came and conquered and left. No. And today historians realize that the impact of the Assyrian Empire on the culture and the peoples of the Middle East was a very, very profound thing. So its fall naturally came as a devastation to the entire region. Archaeologist Sarah Melville, whose theory I'm going to talk about today as to how the Assyrian Empire and the Assyrian state fell, said this, that the Assyrian Empire held sway over the entire Near East. It was the largest, best organized empire the ancient Western world had yet seen. I would even add to that and say, maybe even a lot later also, that held um, was something that was true, that held true years and years later. And remember, we had talked earlier that even with the fall of the Assyrian Empire, its system went on. The Achaemenids, or the Persians, adopted the Assyrian system, and then the Greeks, and so on, up until the Roman Empire. So the Assyrian Empire had controlled the known world. This is a fact. Another Assyriologist, Peter Machinist at Harvard University, says that the Assyrian Empire was a colossus, the largest and most complex political structure of the ancient Near East. Now, I ask you, would it be possible to rule an empire to be labeled a complex political structure by simply being barbarians? Would that be possible? Sorry. I don't think so. I don't think any of us would say, yes, it's possible for to have simply barbarians running around and controlling these entire regions, these big regions with all these peoples, and running them in a very sophisticated way, and having a monetary system and having an economic system where the center is benefiting from the periphery, the center being Nineveh and Ashur benefiting from all of the states. It just is impossible. So what did happen in 612 BC? Now, let me get you to participate a little bit. What happened in 612 BC? That's kind of a famous year that everybody talks about. It's thrown around. But what did happen in 612 BC? Can I have some participation from my bright students?
The fall of the Assyrian Empire.
Fall of the entire empire, or
just Nineveh?
Nineveh was destroyed in 612. Yeah. Not Nimrod in 612 BC. Ashur was destroyed in 614 BC. You're within the range. Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC.
Wouldn't that be considered that it would be the fall of the Assyrian Empire since that was the capital?
Actually, no. Good question. No, the Assyrian Empire and the Assyrian state went on. And as we'll see later on, the Assyrian capital, as it were, or center, switches to the city of Haran. Haran is in Syria at the time. It's near the Euphrates. Now, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, there's a rough map of it. I happen to think the area was larger than that, but that's roughly the area that covers Egypt and even parts of Sudan and all the way to the Soviet Union or Russia, deep into Iran, deep into Turkey, conquered Cyprus, had Ionians who were Greeks, and Arabs and Persians and Elamites and Egyptians. All kinds of people lived within the Assyrian Empire. Remember, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was based on the Middle Assyrian Empire, so you have a lot of continuity. The Persians ruled for a couple of hundred years. The Neo-Babylonian Empire that came after the Assyrians ruled for about 70 years. But the Assyrian Empire continuously ruled for something like 800 to 1,000 years. That is an incredible period. And that's a long, long time. Now, if you think back, if you look back to, say, the time of Christ, 2000 BC, you think that's a long time. Well, the Assyrians at the time of the fall of Assyria could easily look back 2,000 years prior and see that their state had been established at that time. So we're talking about a long period of time. So what happens? Let's get down to some specifics here. Ashur-bani-pal has a son, Ashur-etil-ilani. He's the chosen son of Ashur-bani-pal to rule, and he takes over after the death of his father, Ashur-bani-pal. Now this image is not Ashur-bani-pal. I have to qualify it. Some of you who have been exposed to Assyrian art should know that artwork comes from the time of which king? There's silence. Which king is that? Anybody want to take a guess? No one wants to take, okay. That's okay. That's not fair of me to...
What was the question again?
The question was, the image that is there is of a crown prince speaking to the king. Just to kind of convey that Ashurbanipal handed the reins to his son Ashur-etil-Ilani. And the question was, but that image doesn't fit the time of Ashurbanipal. Which king is it from?
Shalamansar or Sargon?
Oh,
Sargon.
those are, yeah, two different.
Sargon.
Sargon II.
Sargon II.
Good, yeah. So that's Sargon II with his son Sennacherib as crown prince. So Ashurbanipal hands the reins of power to his son as he should, but there's a lot of conflict in Assyria. And eventually Ashur-etil-Ilani he's helped by Sin Shum Lishir, who is a eunuch who does not belong in the royal line. And he rules until 621, meaning the king's son. And then this eunuch by the name of Sin Shum Lishir takes power for only 1 year. And then he is driven out. There's more conflict. Yes?
Was it because eunuchs aren't supposed to be a part of the family?
Yes.
Like rule and all that?
Yes,
Or-
he's definitely not. He's a court official, so he's very close to the reins of power, but he is definitely not supposed to be king. So this tells you right away there's some major disruption here within the flow of Assyrian kings, how they conquered. So this to me represents some major problem. How a eunuch was able to take power when the eunuch cannot have children, of course, and can't continue the line, the royal line. Well, he's then driven out within a year by Ashurbanipal's second son, Sin-Shar Ishukin, or Ishkin, yes.
Sorry, so the eunuch ruled at some point? Because what I thought, I had written down that was that Ashur-etil-Ilani was assisted by...
He was. And then after he was assisted, somehow the eunuch takes over.
It's not known how he took over?
It's not known because we don't have, unfortunately, this is a...
Without the king passing away, I'm sorry.
Oh, the king had passed away.
Oh, okay.
The king had passed away, and his second son did not take power until he has a conflict with the eunuch. This is like almost one of those Disney films, you know, the evil visor. But we don't know the real truth here. We don't know what happened. We do know that years later, the mother of Nabonidus, who is the king of Babylon at the time, who comes from the city of Haran, was alive at this time. And she writes about the Assyrian kings list, but she does not give favor to these last three kings. So a lot of people are probably extremely disappointed with what's going on here. There's a lot of violence going on within the Assyrian state. Now, just without looking at the sources, what do you think happens when there's a lot of violence in the state, when you have the government fighting with each other and there's a lot of killing going back and forth?
No order.
There's no order. There's loss of order. There's chaos. Do you think taxation is going to go on as usual?
No, it's going to go sky high.
And there's going to be disruptions with commerce. There's going to be disruptions with alliances. But somehow Assyria still kind of retains its allies. Now remember, Ashurbanipal had done a lot of work, and so had his forefathers, to get to the point where the entire Middle East is a very quiet area. It's really, the empire is at peace. And then this happens. So there's conflicts, and the last son of Ashurbanipal is the one who confronts the enemies of Assyria. Now, according to Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, Ashurbanipal, prior to the coming of his two sons, and Kandalalu, Lalau of Babylon, who had grown up in the Assyrian court, rules Babylon. And this is after, remember Ashurbanipal's brother, who had taken over, who was appointed as crown prince over the city of Babylon. Then there's a conflict between the two brothers, and Ashurbanipal conquers Babylon. Well, this of course had weakened the Assyrian state, but Ashurbanipal has placed someone else in power, and there is peace. And in 627, there begins to develop the conflict because both Ashurbanipal and the king of Babylon pass away. And so the order that was placed on the empire begins to fall apart. It wasn't through force, you have to remember, that things were kept in order. There was a lot of diplomacy, a lot of respect, possibly, a lot of trust that went on. So when these two great kings pass away, something happens to the empire and conflict results. And there is the weakening of the Assyrian Empire and a civil war in which Stephanie Dalley says, and Stephanie Dalley, by the way, for those of you who are not familiar, is an incredible Assyriologist. She wrote the book that I have with me today that I'm going to quote from, The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, The Mystery of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, among other things. But she's one of those historians that looks very carefully and doesn't simply believe in the record, but thinks about it. So in 614 BC, there's a lot of going back and forth conflict between a man who rises to power by the name of Nabopolassar, who is the father of Nebuchadnezzar. And there's a lot of scrimmages that go back and forth between the Assyrians and the people of Babylon and their allies. And there's a lot of different entities getting involved here. So the city of Ashur, which we came to know as the holy center of the Assyrian Empire, the Vatican of the Assyrians, the Jerusalem of the Assyrians, the Mecca of the Assyrians, falls in 614 BC. Ashur is where Assyrian kings are crowned. Ashur is where Assyrian kings are buried. And it's a very, very important city, and it is where the temple of Ashur is. And the temple of Ashur is something that all Assyrians identify with as a structure, a holy structure, a religious structure, also a symbol of national identity. Sort of like the Statue of Liberty, except the Statue of Liberty is made in France and brought to the United States. The Temple of Ashur was made in Assyria and kept in Assyria. So Ashur falls in 614 BC. Nineveh falls in 612 BC. Now between these times, of course, we're going fast with these dates, but you have to understand that there's a lot of conflict. And the Assyrians attack and go back to a defensive position. They attack and they go back to a defensive position. They're defeated, but they rise again during this time. Okay, so 614 to 612, a lot of fighting goes on even before that, where the Babylonians have a lot of setback. Now, the Assyrians continue the offensive war against Babylon and the Medes. The Medes get involved. Who are the Medes? Can anyone give me any kind of guess as to any questions about the Medes, first of all? Maybe I should ask that. Does everyone know who the Medes are? No one knows.
They were always, weren't they in the eastern region?
Yes.
Refused to.
Yes, they were in the eastern region in what is Iran today, say around the Lake Caspian. And who they are is kind of a mystery also, but they're mentioned in a lot of sources, like Herodotus mentions them and other people mention them. The Bible mentions them. They are seemingly a nomadic people who have settled, and the Assyrians ally with them at times, and They trade with them because they're horse breeders. They're kind of a nomadic people. They're not seen as a sophisticated people. The Assyrians look eastward for sophistication. When they conquer the empire, they see, the Phoenicians and the people living in Syria and Canaan as more sophisticated people, and the Egyptians. They look to the east and they see these nomadic-like people or tribal people, and they don't view them as very civilized. And so the Medes are one of those people. And the Medes really have not left us a lot of records. We don't see, for example, something that says, I, so-and-so, am the king of the Medes. We just don't see that. So what we have to go by is something called the Babylonian Chronicles, which are a series of tablets that are written and very dry writing. It's not the typical, when you see King Ashur-nasir-pal or King Ashurbanipal say, I did this, I did that, I flayed them alive, I did this, I did that to the city, I took so many prisoners, I brought... No, it's kind of very dry. So I have a couple of quotes, and I just wanted to... this is an example of that quote, the 14th year of the king of Akkad. Notice the king of Akkad, not Babylonia, because that wasn't a term that was used, because the southern region was called Akkad, okay? The 14th year, which is 612 BC, the king of Akkad and his troops moved as far as Nasibina. What is Nasibina? Kasha, you know who I'm looking at. It's
Southeast of Turkey.
Yeah, it's Nasibin. And later in the class, we're going to study Nasibin and how what we call the first university in the world was founded in Nasibin, the first Assyrian university in the world. The first university in the world founded by Assyrians, excuse me. So it says, the 14th year of the king of Akkad and his troops moved as far as Nasibina, pillage and banishment, ... There's writings missing there. And the Rasupians were brought to Nineveh before the king of Akkad. Let's go back. So those are the kinds of writings that you see. That's a sample, and I'm going to read to you a couple of more things from the writings of the Babylonian Chronicles. So the Babylonian Chronicles talk about how the warfare goes back and forth between the armies of Assyria and the armies of Nabopolassar and his allies, the Medes. Other people are joining in. Other nationalities are joining in. The Scythians join in, who were previously the allies of the Assyrians. They've joined in now. Why have the Scythians joined in to this fight? Can anyone take a guess? Wealth. Basmagano. Just that one word. That's looting. I mean, you have to know, when we talk about the Assyrian Empire being the most sophisticated empire the world had seen, you are talking about wealth. The city of Nineveh, the city of Ashur, the city of Nimrud, Arbela, these are very wealthy cities, and they contain the wealth of the entire world, the entire region. So when they're falling, and you're a tribal people, and you're not doing so well, you might cut in on the action and get something, right? And so the Scythians think, well, yeah, oaths and treaties aren't important anymore, because remember, Sarhaddon had married his daughter to a Scythian king to forge a treaty between the Assyrians and the Scythians. And that treaty is now no more. And so you have now the Persians also joining in. And so you have the Medes and the Persians, two Iranian people. They're newcomers. And the Elamites as well. So when we talk about the Medes, I'm sorry to go back to this point, I'm not sure if I clarified, but we don't have a lot of records of the Medes, but they're an Iranian-speaking people. So people often say the Medes and the Persians. they neglect the Elamites, but the Elamites are going to be added into that because these are three different groups. And who are the descendants of the Medes today? Does anyone know?
Kurds, MSS,
Are you sure?
or the Iranians.
Well, nobody really
They say
knows.
both, so I don't know.
Nobody knows. I just want to address this point because the Kurds take sometimes a lot of pride in being the descendants of the Medes. And in fact, an article that was in the National Geographic a long time ago had this photograph of some Kurdish families and said their descendants took over Nineveh a long time ago. Well, I mean, there's no historical fact to that. Now, you might have people saying that, and you might have Kurdish nationalists perhaps claiming descent from or having the Urartu belong to them, and the Medes belong to them, and the Mitanni belong to them, and the other people belong to them, but there are no historical records verifying that.
Isn't Nowruz celebrated because they say that their ancestors, which was the Medes, took down an Assyrian king, which is why they celebrate Nowruz?
No, Nowruz is New Year, and it's from the Assyrian Babylonian New Year. I mean, it's just a copy of the celebration during spring. Now, whether the Assyrians were the ones, or the Babylonians, or the people of Mesopotamia who came up with Cheb Nisan or the Akitu festival, we don't know, but the written record shows that the very first time it was celebrated was there, and the celebration was taken eastward, and the Medes were, and the Persians and others took it over.
So technically, they're celebrating the Assyrian New Year
Yes.
more accurately than we are.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that, but yes, you're right. They continue to celebrate it. We had also references, and we're going to get into this later into the class, references of the New Year celebration. But you know, Christianity had such an impact on the Assyrians that I think that a lot of the ancient rituals and traditions kind of went by the wayside. Yes?
I don't
Sorry.
mean to get political, but if the Kurds, let's just assume that they are descendants of the Medes, and the Medes are Eastern Iranian people historically.
Right.
Why would they hold claims to any land in northern Iraq where they're trying to establish?
It's part of their empire.
But so how long did the Medes empire last?
Yeah, I mean, there's no, I mean, the theory is not a solid theory, and it's not respected by academics, I should say that no academic really takes that theory very seriously.
Just I want to clarify, so the Medes, they sided with Babylon just for a while?
Yes, I mean, the king of Akkad and the Median king at the time got together and formed a deal outside the cities of Ashur and laid claim to these cities. Now the Medes, they conquered and they left. And they never left their trace. More likely what happened here is that the Medes looted the city of Nineveh and Ashur and other cities and took the wealth and left. They had no reason to remain. Whereas the Babylonians, or the people of Babylon and the Nabopolassar, came from a more settled, civilized tradition of rule. So he kind of took over the Assyrian Empire and managed the Assyrian Empire, what was left of the Assyrian Empire. But the Medes and the Scythians and all of these people left. There is a very derogatory a passage by Sarhaddun that talks about how he, when he rebuilds Babylon, this goes to the point that I was making about these people who were uncivilized. And he says, I gathered them again and restored them to their city. And as he's gathering them, he says, I gathered them from among the, and the translator translates this, the foreign riffraff. He calls them the riffraff. You know, people who are not very sophisticated, not very developed, not very civilized, and he gathers the Babylonians from among those people and brings them back to the city of Babylon, because his father, Sennacherib, had punished them by dispersing them and taking over the city. Now, this Assyrians continue the offensive, and what does that do? There's a theory of why the Assyrian Empire fell, because its armies were still strong. Despite the fact that they had endured a civil war, this was the greatest war machine the world had known. So how did it fall to a coalition of armies of the Babylonians and Medes and Scythians, who were really not as well trained as the Assyrians? Well, the theory that is advanced by one Assyriologist, Sarah Melville, is that the Assyrians were so used to advancing, they were so used to offensive warfare, that they forgot to take care of their homeland. They neglected their homeland. They left a lot of cities exposed. They left the heartland exposed to attack. And they came from a very military tradition, and according to Melville, the problem was their military prowess in the end caused their downfall, because they did not act very defensively. They acted very offensively. And what she's talking about is also when, after the fall of Nineveh, Ashur-uballit takes power. Ashur-uballit II, he is of course not, the Assyrian king dies in Nineveh. We do not know the circumstances of his death. We can only imagine that it was a horrible slaughter of people, including many of the elites of the Assyrian state. And Ashur-uballit takes over. He's a general. Now, for the first time in history, an Assyrian king is not really crowned in Ashur, in the city of Ashur. Why? Because Ashur is no longer under Assyrian control. They've lost their holy city. So Ashur-uballit takes power, and he moves the Assyrian center to Haran, where he seeks the alliance of the Egyptians. And this is something very interesting. It's an interesting development, and it's an interesting diplomatic move by two powers towards each other, Egypt and Assyria. Remember, years earlier, the Assyrians had devastated Egypt by taking over it and driving the kingdom of Cush, which had dominated Egypt under the pharaohs of Cush, what we call the Black Pharaohs, and had driven them back to Nubia, or to the Sudan area. Now you have an alliance between the Assyrians and the Egyptians send their troops to help the Assyrians. And this is a big move. There's a lot going on. The Egyptians in certain places have to fight their way through. They are blocked by a Judean king, and he is killed, and the Egyptians press on to come to assist the Assyrians. Ashur-uballit and the Egyptians together attack Haran, they leave Haran, and there are cities around it that have been stationed by Nabopolassar. They then attack Haran and recover some of these cities, but they're not able to ultimately recover the city of Haran. And so the Egyptian army and the Assyrian army is defeated by Nebuchadnezzar this time, who is the crown prince under Nabopolassar, who is the son of Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar II. In 612 BC, after a prolonged civil war, Assyria's two former vassals, the Babylonians and the Medes, conquered and destroyed Nineveh, the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The great city went up in flames, never to regain its former status. 3 years later, the same rebels razed Assyria's western metropolis, Haran, crushing the last-ditch resistance of Assyria's last king, Ashur-uballit II. This event sealed the fate of the Assyrian Empire, and that is where the story of Assyria usually ends in history books. And so what Simo Parpola is talking about here is that for the average Assyriologist, really their studies kind of come to an end. This is where, this is the dreaded period for a lot of people who enjoy Assyrian history. This is the period that ends the existence of the Assyrian state, and Assyriologists kind of stop. This is the timeline that they stop at. And so when you ask them, well, what happened to the Assyrians afterwards? A lot of Assyriologists might say, well, that's not my job. You have to ask someone else. And then when you ask what is called a Syriac specialist, he might say, well, that's not my job. You know, that's the job of the Assyriologist. And they kind of point fingers at each other through this gap in history. One sort of begins when Christianity comes, as if there were no people there before, and they simply call themselves Syriac-speaking Christians. And then the other kind of stops and is pointing a finger at the Syriac-speaking scholar, or dealing with Syriac-speaking people from 612 BC, or in this case 609 or 605 BC. This is a quote from Assyriologist Sidney Smith, and I want to show it to you because this is a very, 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 very common understanding. Let's read that together. The disappearance of the Assyrian people, that's a very powerful thing, will always remain a unique and striking phenomenon in ancient history. Other similar kingdoms and empires have indeed passed away, but people have lived on. Recent discoveries have, it is true, shown that poverty-stricken communities perpetuated the old Assyrian names at various places. For instance, on the ruined site of Ashur for many centuries, but the essential truth remains the same. A nation which had existed for over 2,000 years, and had ruled over a wide area lost its independent character. And he goes on to explain that the Assyrians, their very nature, they kind of committed racial suicide, as it were, by being who they were or by being what they were. Other historians also follow this kind of almost like biblical line about the Assyrians. You know, somehow it's very unique. They must have been punished by God. That, you know, their fate is much worse than other nations. So I told you about the theory of how the Assyrians fell. And what happens once Assyria falls? What really happens? Well, the sources are not very clear, other than the Babylonian Chronicle, which is a very dry chronicle talking about how the king of Akkad, or the king of Babylon, advances and defeats Assyrians and goes back. Sometimes he's pushed back, sometimes he goes forward, but ultimately he goes forward and he takes over Assyria. He takes over Nineveh and its cities. The Bible also has something to say. The Old Testament has something to say. There's the line in Nahum, "Your shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria, your nobles are asleep." Your nobles are asleep. Well, the truth is that this was a very profound devastation of the Assyrian state. This very sophisticated machine eventually was not the same as it was. But the truth is that historical records show that, archaeology shows that Assyria somehow continued to live on, and Assyrians lived on. So why is it that we don't know? Why are people like Sidney Smith and others like him, including our own John Joseph, who is an Assyrian professor who's written a few books and a few articles on the modern Assyrians, who very clearly says the destruction of the Assyrian Empire really led to the destruction of the Assyrian people, and the Assyrian people today are not the descendants of the ancient Assyrians. That's completely That thinking is completely wrong, says John Joseph. The modern Assyrians are a mix of people. They are an Aramaic-speaking Christian group that was really gathered by kind of a church or churches together. So what leads them to say this? Well, Stephanie Dalley, who I told you is a very thoughtful person, says something very interesting. She says this idea of the destruction of Assyria and it's turning its cities into heaps and ruins, desolate places, is really it's a metaphor. All this language is really a traditional way of discussing, it's called lamentation literature, discussing the end of a time, the end of an era. It's kind of, Assyrians say bilyaya, lamenting the past. And there's a lot of literature like this about Ur and Uruk and other cities, the destruction of these cities, that's called lamentation literature. And so you'd see a lot of this, whether in Sumerian or Akkadian literature, talking about the destruction of the city of Ur and Uruk. In fact, when the cities were not destroyed. You will also see a king saying, for example, I turned Nineveh into heaps and ruins, but that's not literally true. Why? Because Stephanie Dalley says something very interesting. She says in her book, first of all, she quotes from Nabonidus, who is the last king of Babylon. And he talks about Nabopolassar, who's his forefather, who's just a couple of kings away. Remember, there were about 4 kings of the Neo-Babylonian kingdom, and then Cyrus takes over. The person known as Cyrus the Great, the Persian or Elamite, more accurately. And even though it says the 14th year of Nabopolassar's reign, after the siege of Nineveh was successful, the king of Akkad and his troops moved as far as Nasibina. He brings back these people into Nineveh, meaning Nineveh was a place to meet, meaning Nineveh wasn't completely destroyed. It wasn't all ruins. So it was being used by the king of Akkad to receive people there, you see? And it also says that Nabonidus, according to Stephanie Dalley, has this quote which is very important, and you've got to think about this. Quote, as for the king of Babylon, now he's talking about Nabopolassar. This is Nabonidus talking about Nabopolassar. As for the king of Babylon, the work of Marduk, meaning the creation of God, right? The king of Babylon is the creation of God to Nabonidus. For whom pillage is an abomination. For whom pillage is an abomination, meaning for whom destruction, ruining, is something that they don't like. The king did not like destruction. He, Nabopolassar, did not lay a finger on the cult of any of the gods in Ashur and in Nineveh, but went around with his hair unkempt in mourning and slept on the ground as his couch. This is something really incredible to kind of fathom. I mean, think about this. He's going around, I mean, this tradition has passed on the Assyrians today, right? When you're in mourning, you don't wash your hair, you don't comb your hair, you don't shave, you kind of keep yourself in a very bad state. And he's sleeping on the floor. You've heard of this. I'm going to sleep on the floor because I'm really sad. Well, did it please Nabopolassar to see the destruction of, for example, the cult buildings, which are, the temple of Ishtar and the temple of... I mean, they could have lost control of their troops. They could have lost control of the Medes, of the Scythians. Remember, we're talking about these wild tribal people who go into these very sophisticated cities for the first time and see a lot of wealth, and they might see these temples which possess a lot of wealth in terms of gold and silver and precious stones, as an opportunity to do what? Steal, loot. And so it's probably why Nabopolassar is reported as seeking the floor as his couch and keeping his hair unkempt, because he did not like pillage. Pillage was an abomination for him. It was wrong. And so this tells us what? That the Babylonian administration that took over didn't simply seek the complete destruction of Assyrian cities and the Assyrian people. True, the elites of the Assyrian Empire, the people who ruled, the people who ran the armies, the military was their target. But you have to remember the relationship between Babylon and Nineveh, Babylon and Ashur, wasn't simply of enemies. I've made this point before, that these were not states with exact borders. Their culture was related. And so you didn't quite have the feeling of completely devastating the city and killing all of its people. That wasn't something that really was envisioned. We don't see it certainly in the records. And what Sennacherib did to Babylon was something very unusual. So remember, the south had many cities. It wasn't simply one. It wasn't just Babylon. It was Nippur, it was Ur, it was so many other cities in southern Iraq. And these cities had governors, and they often appealed to the Assyrians for assistance. So there were a lot of cultural, even familial links between these people, social, cultural, political links. So it was a very bad thing to destroy these centers. And so what Stephanie Daly is saying is, well, the idea that we had that Nineveh was completely destroyed, whether it's in the Bible or in one case where Xenophon is a Greek leader who is fighting for the Persians against another Persian group, leads his 10,000 through these areas. And he begins to name these cities. He says, I went by these cities. He's reporting that he went by these cities. Now they've fallen. One of them is the site of Nimrud, which he refers as Larissa. And another one is Nineveh, which he refers to as Maspila. According to Stephanie Daly, Xenophon didn't really see what he said he saw. In other words, these cities were not as destroyed as what he says. Now, according to another scholar by the name of Tadmor, he says that the word Maspila comes from the Aramaic Mashpila or Mushpilla, like a reference to the ruins of Nineveh. It's possible, but according to Stephanie Daly, because Assyria really lived on, what Xenophon is saying doesn't make any sense. And how did it live on? And we're going to go over this hopefully in other classes, but you see a continuation, especially in cities like Dur-Katlimu. You see, for example, Neo-Assyrian writing after 609 BC, continuing on during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled for about 40 years. He ruled Babylon for about 40 years. And so during his time, if Assyria had been completely destroyed, would you have a lot of correspondence from Assyrian cities? You wouldn't really have that. You wouldn't really have people in Nineveh, in Ashur, in Nimrud writing. The theory now is that these cities, although partially destroyed, were not fully destroyed. And although partially destroyed, they also relied on other cities near them, smaller towns, to kind of operate. By no means was Assyria what it was before the fall of the empire, but certainly it went on. And it went on during the Neo-Babylonian Empire, when the Medes have absolutely no trace, because the idea was Assyria was divided between the Medes and the Babylonians, the Medes conquering Nineveh, the Babylonians conquering Ashur and other southern portions. This has been disproved by a lot of historians because there actually exists zero historical evidence, documentary, archaeological, zero, of the Medes ruling over the city of Nineveh at any time. So these cities went on. How do we know they went on? Well, during the time of the Parthians, you have the rebuilding of the temple of Ashur, the second time. And the temple of Ashur is rebuilt in the AD period, in the BC period, and it's destroyed only over 200 years AD by the Sasanians. Nineveh is rebuilt not by the Parthians, but during the time of the Parthians. I was corrected one time. I said these were Parthian times because I showed an image of the city of Ashur from the Parthian times. I wasn't implying that the Parthians themselves, the ethnic Parthians, were the ones building the city. No, the Assyrians still lived there and considered it important to rebuild their own city, but it was during the reign of the Parthians is what I meant. So you have correspondence from cities like Dur-Katlimu, and there was actually a very interesting lecture given at the University of Chicago a couple of years ago where a professor from Germany, I forget his name right now, but we certainly will bring him up. He talked about the correspondence that was available from this period where the Assyrian officials were using Assyrian official names, they were referring to the god Ashur and so on, so there is correspondence. And I'm sure there's more correspondence from the city of Ashur, the city of Nineveh, and other cities after the fall of the Assyrian Empire that we don't know of yet. But if they exist in Dur-Katlimu, you can bet that they exist in other places as well. Well, why didn't the archaeologists like Laird and Hormuz Rassam and Rawlinson and others, Emil Bota, why didn't they see, or Andre who dug up Ashur, why didn't they see the ruins of later periods?
Stop studying.
They stopped studying?
They stopped, they didn't look into that time period.
Close, yes, they weren't interested in that time period. Very good point. They were not interested.
Was there a lot of stuff being quoted from that time?
Well, we have to remember, yes and no. Yes, I was talking to Rameel earlier, and I mentioned that a lot of the writing at this time was probably done on scrolls in Aramaic. But you know, scrolls don't survive as much as tablets do, because they're made either in stone or, and by the way, a very interesting thing, ordinary written tablets were written on clay tablets, but very important tablets were written either using gold or silver or stone. Typically, real estate contracts were written in stone. Maybe that's where that expression comes from. It's written in stone. So the Assyrians considered real estate very important. So the cities went on. These archaeologists who dug up these cities were really interested in the biblical narratives. And so they went for the biblical material, which was trying to prove, the existence of Nimrod, who built the Tower of Babel, and Sennacherib, and how he took over Judea, and so this was what they were interested in. When they found ruins from the period, from the Hellenic period, during the time of the Greeks, in these cities, they kind of disregarded it. There's a statue of Hercules, showing Greek influence in the city of Nineveh. Well, that's very interesting because that shows that Assyrians were living there and were exchanging with the Greeks, culture and material wealth, and they were living in the city of Nineveh. And we're talking now, 100 BC, a couple of hundred years AD, until the arrival of the Sasanians. The Sasanians are the ones that bring about destruction in Nineveh and in Ashur. They're the ones who destroy the temple of Ashur and destroy various places in Nineveh. And so there is ash that even Laird found from the time of the Sasanian destruction, which is long after the destruction of the Medes and the Babylonians. So remember, this is 612 BC, or 600 BC, and that's 200 AD. So you're talking 600 years later. So the Assyrians went on. Now, what happens in the AD period, of course? Well, a lot happens. In the BC period, some Assyrians convert to Zoroastrianism, which is the religion of the Persian Empire. Some Assyrians convert to Judaism before the coming of Christianity, before the coming of Christ. And some Assyrians stay with their old religions and their old cults. Remember now, by this time, the cult of Ashur probably no longer has the relevance it has, but the people are speaking their language, which is Aramaic, and they are practicing their culture and their traditions, but they've changed because the world around them has changed, and they're interacting as civilized people with others. And so in the next class, we're going to get into references to the Assyrian identity during Sasanian times. This is going to be a very interesting class because, well, really every class is an interesting class, isn't it? Thank you for that. But really we want to address, because remember there's this accusation leveled against modern Assyrians. One scholar whom I knew and respected, but I completely disagreed with his assertions, is John Joseph, who says, there's no link between ancient and modern Assyrians, or Chip Coakley, who's a scholar at Harvard, who says that the Assyrian ethnicity, the reference to Assyrian cultural ethnicity and so on, is a bogus ethnicity, in quote marks. I say bogus ethnicity. Well, that's not really fair, and it's not accurate, because this is a tradition, like all traditions, that is learned. People are not born into a tradition. They're not born Christians, really. They're born as human beings, and they learn a lot of things. You are baptized as a child, for example, as a Christian, or you are born into the Muslim faith or the Jewish faith. But really, what do you have to do? You have to be taught certain things. You as a child will learn. So if the Assyrians are educating themselves about their past heritage using non-Assyrian sources, it doesn't mean it's bogus ethnicity. It means they're learning about their heritage. And whether it comes from British sources or American sources or Iraqi sources, they're learning about their own heritage. And if it's legitimate, it's legitimate. So I always felt that Chip Coakley didn't say it right. And of course, he loved our culture, our modern culture, our Syriac culture, and our language, and so on. So, and he came to one of the Assyrian conventions, and I warned him. I said, "You're going to get beat up if you mix." He said, "Oh no," he was a kind of a scared British guy. He said, "Oh, I would never say anything like that." I said, "Just your footnote number 79. Don't ever repeat that in your book." So he did not. And when I remember we had a funny moment, he's giving a lecture and he's saying the Assyrian alphabet, the Assyrian alphabet, the Assyrian alphabet. And so somebody in the audience, a smart blank, says to him, "Why do you keep calling it the Assyrian alphabet? I thought it was the Syriac alphabet." And he kind of looks scared and he looks at me and I said, "Go ahead and say what you want about the alphabet. Just don't say anything about the Assyrian people." So this was kind of an important period to answer others. And of course, from people like Coakley and John Joseph came others who turned this into a very political thing. And I always, I'll end with this. When I visited the Nineveh plain, I actually was very saddened that a lot of our people living in the plains, such as Karimlish and Tilkepe and Alqush and Baghdad and Telescof and other towns, Batnaya, all these towns that are around the city of Nineveh, the people did not really know anything about their heritage. And it was a very sad thing that the knowledge of the past had been politicized. And people had been taught to stay away from this word Assyrian and use instead Arab or Chaldean or Syriac, Suraya, but stay away from the word Assyrian. And it's very unfortunate because the comments of allegedly Jalal Talabani once said to the Assyrians, that this Kurdish leader, everything above the ground belongs to us, everything below the ground belongs to you, meaning you just have the history. But I say, okay, let's work with what's below the ground. Below the ground is oil. You got a lot of resources. You also have a lot of ruins upon which you can base a tourist industry, and a lot of wealth. And on the ground is something very important. It's land, it's real estate. And so what is on the ground really necessarily belongs to our people, but if you have a mindset which says we have nothing to do with the people that lived here thousands of years ago, that, I believe, takes away from political rights of people as well as their legitimate claims to that land. And it's very unfortunate. And kind of to wind down with that, I'll use a quote from the current patriarch of the Chaldean Church, whose knowledge of history, I should say, is really better than this quote. But he said, why do we have to use the Nineveh plain as an expression? Why don't we use something else? And when he was asked, like what? He said, why don't we call it Hamdaniya? And I thought it was very unfortunate, and so many others did, because first of all, everybody calls it Nineveh. I mean, that's the name of that place, and it's the Nineveh plain. Hamdaniya is a term used by the Turks for the area of Qaraqosh or for the area of Baghdad. Why would you want to call it a name that doesn't really belong to that area, simply to push away the idea that you have legitimate claim to this area? Made no sense to me, other than that there are these political intrigues that lead to a disruption of true historical knowledge. So in the next lecture, we're going to study the Sasanian period and how we have Assyrians who are now Christians reclaiming their ancient Assyrian heritage by referring to it. Thank you.